Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Spicer, and I'm one of the assistant professors in the Division of Infectious Diseases. I have an interest in medical education and thought that I would record a session on how to do Zoom teaching and specifically how to make an interactive teaching session. I think that many of us have already experienced a number of Zoom teaching sessions. And I think through a lot of these experiences, we have all learned some best practices. And I wanted to share some of those, ranging from some really basic information about how to set up your Zoom account to make sure that you have access to some of the advanced features, but also to talk about some more advanced techniques that will hopefully be new to at least some of you on watching this session. So my learning objectives today is by the end of this session, I really want participants to be able to change the advanced Zoom settings to correspond with their teaching needs, to determine how to establish an effective learning climate for Zoom based on the size of the learner group. I think that creating an effective and interactive learning climate on Zoom is actually really difficult. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about that since I've been leading a number of workshops over Zoom and have experimented with a few different things. And then I want to everyone to be able to create an interactive learner-centered teaching session using tools available on Zoom. And in particular, I'm going to talk about how you could facilitate a case discussion on Zoom, but a lot of these same principles could be applied to other interactive teaching sessions. So what I'm going to talk about first is setting the stage. I think that this is a lot of doing really good teaching virtually, is making your settings on whatever type of software you're using, whether that is Zoom or another software, and then some tips and tricks for creating a good learning climate in the beginning of the session. And then I'm going to give some examples of how to run a session using some of the advanced Zoom tools. So first, let's talk about setting the stage. So before even starting your session, I think it's really important to go over some of the basic Zoom settings and to make sure that you've enabled some of the advanced settings on your computer. So I'm going to get out of this PowerPoint that I'm sharing. And what I would like to do is to show you how I sign on to Zoom. It's really important if you have an account with an institution like we have here at Emory to join the meeting in a way that actually allows you to sign on through Emory. So let me sign out. And the important thing here is that you need to sign in with SSO. So this is what allows you to sign in through Emory. And so you want to put Emory as your company division and click continue. And then it's going to take you to your Emory login where you're going to put your network ID and password. And if you log on that way, it's going to allow you to access some of the advanced features on Zoom. And I encourage you to make sure that you've downloaded the Zoom app on your computer because this will allow you to do some of the more advanced features. So I'm going to open in the Zoom app and I'm going to start a meeting. Okay. So here I'm going to go ahead and start my video and unmute myself. And I'm going to maximize this screen so that you guys can focus on this instead of some of the other things on my desktop. Okay, so first things with getting set up on Zoom, as I mentioned, I think it's really important to look at some of the settings. And so to do that, you're going to go up here to Zoom. And if you have a Windows computer, it may look a little bit different, but you want to find where it says preferences and pull that up. Once the preferences come up, you want to go to the general preferences. And within here, you'll see that there's a lot of different options on the Zoom app that you can look at. But to get to some of the more advanced settings that we're going to talk about, you actually need to go to View More Settings, which will open in a browser. So let's go through and look at some of these settings. Okay, so going down, some of these are a little less important for what we're going to talk about today for the session. There are things about requiring a password, scheduling meetings, and things like that. But I really want to go down to some of the basic meeting functions. So you want to make sure that you have chat enabled, which is usually enabled on our accounts. You can decide whether or not you want private chat to be available. One thing that I think is important to let people know is that the private chats are actually viewable if you are recording your Zoom session and saving it. There's actually a separate text file that gets downloaded. And within that text file, not only will you see the regular chats, but you will also see the private chats. And so I've made it a habit to tell the students that I'm working with that private chats can be seen by people downloading it, because I think a lot of people don't recognize that, and is an important thing to mention. You can enable file transfer, and we'll talk a little bit later about what this is and show it in action in one of the sessions that I'm going to do. And then you can enable co-hosts. This is going to be important because the hosts are the only individuals who can access some of the advanced settings that I'm going to mention, like breakout rooms and polling and things like that. And so if you want to be able to add a co-host, this needs to be active. Polling, we will talk about, is an important thing to mention. And then you can have settings for screen sharing. Now, you can decide who is going to be able to share screens. I think it's actually helpful to have all participants able to share screens, especially if you're doing an interactive teaching session. This is also important if you're going to do breakout rooms, because then you really want people within the breakout rooms to be able to share their screens. And so it's important to make sure that you save any of those updated settings. You can allow annotation. So this is if you're teaching and you want someone to annotate what you have up. Allow participants to be able to save, create a whiteboard, and you can have it auto-save what you do on a whiteboard, which I think can also be helpful. And then if you continue to go down, you can play with some of these settings yourself, but one of the important ones I want to point out is the breakout room. I think that this has been one of the functions that I found very helpful in doing interactive sessions, especially with larger groups. And so make sure that the breakout rooms are enabled and that you as the host are allowed to assign participants to breakout rooms. Now, one of the important things to recognize is a number of the different options I'm going to talk about today are things that you can only do if you are the host of a Zoom session. So what this means is that you need to share your own Zoom account with other people if you're going to be running a Zoom session. So you don't want somebody else to be creating a division account that you're going to be sharing from there, because then you cannot use a lot of these different features. And this has come up when I've been invited to talk at other people's conferences. They typically create the link, but the problem then is that I don't have access to be able to use some of these interactive tools. So again, if you're giving a talk, make sure it is your Zoom link that is actually the one being shared. Okay, so now that I've showed you some of those advanced settings, we can get out of there and we can go back to Zoom. All right, so let's talk about some of the basic things down in the toolbar here, and I'm going to turn off the video right now so that it's not too distracting on the main screen. Okay. Looks like the video is staying on for right now. So what I want to point out are some of the other options that you can see within Zoom. So familiarizing yourself with what's available down here. So I think one thing that you want to look at is the participants. So you can see right here, if you click on this, you're going to see all the participants that are within your Zoom session. And here I have had my husband join so that I can show you some of these more advanced features. And I'm going to go and change myself to the host on his screen. Okay. So when you pull up the different participants, what you can see here is that you have the ability to mute and unmute people as the host. If you click on this More tab, you can see that you can also rename people, you can add a profile picture, and you can ask to start people's videos, you can chat with them, you can make them the host, and you can make them the co-host. And again, this is important if you want other people to be able to do things like create polls, create breakout rooms. They need to have access to be the host or the co-host. So here's where you can manage the participants. You can see down here at the very bottom, you can mute all, which is a very helpful function when you have a really large group of people. You can automatically go down and mute them all. And if you hit this More category, you can also automatically mute participants on entry. You can decide if participants can unmute themselves. And again, all of these are somewhat security features that you can use, or features that you can use to control whether people are able to talk during the session. Okay, so we talked about participants. Now I want to bring up the chat box, which I think most of us are familiar with, but again, this is where you can type messages or questions to other participants in here. And this is a great way, again, for everyone to be able to communicate, especially if you have a very large session. You can do private messaging, as I mentioned, but be careful because those are recorded if people are recording the entire session. And then there are some other options down here to share files, which we'll talk about in a bit, and decide who people can chat with. All right, so we'll talk about screen sharing in a bit and talk about polling in a bit. Now, what I want to show you here is that you can also record the session if you hit the record button. I am actually not using Zoom's record function right now, and that is because when you record a Zoom session, it actually does not record all of the little things you're doing on the screen, so it doesn't show the Zoom toolbars. It also does not necessarily show my participant screen, my chat screen, so it would be difficult for me to show you Zoom features using the Zoom recording. So I'm using a separate screen capture technique. Okay, and we'll talk about some of these other things later on during the session. All right, so now I want to pull up my PowerPoint again, and what I want to talk about is learning climate. What I found on Zoom is that the sessions are very different than in-person sessions. And I think that that's largely because for in-person teaching sessions, we often have that time for small talk or chit chat at the beginning of a session where you can go around and talk to participants in the group. There's time for questions at the end where people can come up to you and ask questions. But a lot of Zoom sessions seem to just start as soon as everybody's there without any of this small talk among groups. And so I think it's helpful to think very carefully about how you can create an enjoyable and safe learning climate in your teaching sessions. So to start the session, I always try to arrive to a session early if I'm teaching. And this is more important if you're teaching a small group session than it is if you're teaching a big lecture. But I arrive early for a few things. One is to make sure that all of my settings are correct. But two, I think it's really important to arrive early and try to potentially talk to other participants. This has been the time that I've gotten to know my students. One of the nice things about using Zoom is you can actually see everybody's name. So even if you don't know people very well, you still can see their name, call them by name, and have a conversation with people. And so I found that arriving early is really helpful for that. The second thing is that I ask people to turn their videos on. Now, if you have a very large session, like 30 participants or more, then turning videos on could potentially be distracting, or it could even potentially decrease how fast the session is going. It can take a lot of bandwidth for people to have videos on and can slow things down. So videos aren't always the answer, but I think that they can be helpful, especially if you're running a small group session. And so what I tend to do when I'm running a small group session is I actually try to turn the video on, and I really like to use the gallery view. So again, you can see up to, 50 people or more on this screen, and you can have a conversation. And so I have used the gallery view when I have held small group panels and have panel speakers. It allows you to be able to see everyone's face, and it makes teaching over Zoom much more personal than when everybody has their video off. I think an important thing if you're going to ask people to turn on their videos is, one, make sure that that's set as an expectation, because as we know, when people are at home, there may be things going on. Kids may be around, dogs come up and start, sitting on people's laps. It can be really tough for people, and it's important for people to know what the expectations are. So what I tend to do when I'm talking on, when I'm doing a Zoom session, is I let people know that it's okay if they're in their sweatpants. I don't expect them to be dressed up for my Zoom session, but I do want them to have videos on, and I do want us to be talking with each other. It makes it much more enjoyable for me as a teacher, and it also allows me to tell if other people are engaged in and enjoying the session. So that is one thing that I like to do. Okay, so let's go back, and I do also want to talk about starting with an icebreaker. So as I mentioned, I think that a number of the Zoom sessions tend to start really abruptly. And what we end up doing in Zoom sessions is just starting with the lecture or the teaching right away. But especially if you have a small group session, starting with a small icebreaker can be helpful to get people talking and ready to engage. So I think this is where group size really has an impact on how you do this. I think you can do it regardless if you have a small group or even a large group of over 100 participants. So when it's a small group, I think that's the optimal time to put it into gallery view and have some type of discussion. So especially right now during the COVID pandemic, we have had a tendency in the teaching sessions that I've run to just ask people how they're doing. Check in, maybe try to ask them what is one new or fun thing that you've been doing recently that's brought joy to your life. Ask them a culture question, what's your favorite food? I think that all of these things can be really helpful to get people engaged and excited to be in a session. One thing that, so I want to show you one thing that we've ended up doing in small groups that's been fun and really easy, even if you don't know the participants really well. And that has been playing with the virtual backgrounds. So I imagine that most of you have experienced the virtual backgrounds by now, as we have all been on many, many Zoom meetings. But if you haven't, what you do is come down here to the area of your video, and there's this little caret that you click on and can select choose virtual background. And when that comes up, you're going to have a variety of options. So in the beginning, there's just 3 that are automatically on Zoom, and it's the space one, the grass, and the San Francisco virtual background. But you can add your own videos or images. So what I did, I downloaded some of Emory's. So Emory has some stock photos you can see here. Created a new virtual background here in front of one of the Emory buildings. You can also upload your own pictures. So during one of our teaching sessions, we asked people to create a background that we're going to talk about during the session. So I pulled up one of my old Africa safari pictures to bring up a talking point. So you can choose whatever background you want. But I find that this has been a really fun way to have a conversation and have some fun at the beginning of some of the sessions. Okay. So next, let's go back and talk about some of the other ways that you can do icebreakers with a larger group, because I think that's where a lot of us end up doing teaching. And this is where I ask a question through 3 different mechanisms. So one is just using the chat function and asking a question and having people put their answers in the chat. The second is using breakout rooms and having people have a discussion with other members of the group, and I'm going to demonstrate how to do that later. And then the last way is to do the polling within Zoom. So let me show you how the polling works. So here, down on the bottom bar, you see this polling function. And this is a really fun way where you can come in and create a new question. So you can see here, this was a poll that I created actually for a session about teaching via Zoom. And I wanted to get an idea of what was the baseline knowledge of the participants I was working with. So here you can see that I asked, which of the following tools have you used in Zoom sessions? And this was nice because not only was it kind of a icebreaker question, but it also allowed me to understand the knowledge and needs of the group that I was working with. And so again, you come in, you create the poll, you launch it, and then you end the poll. And then you can share the results with everybody, okay? And so everybody can see the results and then stop sharing. So creating the questions is really easy. What it does is it actually comes and brings you to the Zoom page where you can have a title for the poll and you just type in your question, you put your answers, and you can have a single choice or multiple choice question. You can save these. So again, this is a poll that I was showing you that I've had here for a couple sessions. So it will keep your polls within your Zoom sessions. All right, so let me X out of there. All right, so now what I want to do is talk a little bit about actually running a session and what are some of the different Zoom tools that you can use. So I'm going to use the example of running a case-based session, and I'm going to use an example from a urinary tract infection core conference that I gave to the internal medicine residents. So the interactive tools that I'm going to talk about and show you how I use it within a case is the whiteboard, the chat function, which we've already talked about, how to do annotations, how to do file sharing, and then how to use Padlet and other editable documents within your teaching, and finally using breakout rooms. All right. So coming back, so again, what I do is come down to share my screen. And for this, I want to use a whiteboard. Now, you'll see whenever you go to share your screen, as most of you are familiar with by now, there's lots of different options to share your iPhone or iPad, which is nice if you want to be able to draw on something using a stylus, and then any of your open windows. But here you can see the whiteboard. So if you click on that and click share, here is what pops up. So the person that I'm sharing with, all they can see right now is this whiteboard. They cannot see this toolbar up here. This toolbar is purely for me or any of the rest of my background. Now, whenever I'm using the whiteboard to teach, I also really like to have the chat up, especially if I'm teaching a large class, because I want people to be able to use the chat to ask me questions. So come up here to your bar, and it'll come down. And again, you see all these options, and one of the options is to open up your chat box. So I typically put my chat box over to the side. I have my whiteboard, and you have lots of options. So you have an option to do text. So for example, if I was teaching about the urinary tract infection, I could type in a 33-year-old male presented with dysuria. And what I did in the session I was teaching is I then asked the participants to ask me questions via the Zoom chat of more information that they wanted about the history. And then I typed it on here on the whiteboard using this typing function. So I talked about his sexual history, I talked about his medications, and I typed because, to be honest, I find the drawing tools a little bit difficult to use. It's a little clunky, and I'm not very good at writing with it, as you can see. I think it's very helpful to draw things, but not very helpful if I want to write words. So I tend to use the text to write words. You can see up here a variety of other things, including their eraser, which is obviously helpful. And here you have the option to save your whiteboard or to clear it. Now, if you save it, now it's saved, and you can see I can go and get it in Finder. So if I was doing a case-based teaching session, I would spend a little bit of time asking people in the chat to ask me questions about the history. I would provide them more information on the whiteboard. And then that's when I'd say, okay, now I want people to go in their small groups. And here is what we are going to do in small groups. All right, so in order to have people work in breakout rooms, what I want to do first is share the file of the completed whiteboard. So what I would do is go here, and I can share whatever file I created. So it's important to know where your whiteboard saves. Typically, it's going to save within a Zoom folder. So on my computer, under Documents is where all my Zoom folders are saved. And you can see here under my most recent session, I have my whiteboard. Click Open, and you'll see that this file was then sent to everyone in the group. Now, one other thing I want people to do is we're going to do breakout rooms, which are really nice. So here you can see with breakout rooms, you can assign participants. It'll tell you how many participants are in your session, and it will tell you, you get to decide how many rooms you want them in. So obviously I only have one other participant. I can only do one other breakout room. But here would be your option to add more. So if I have 20 people, I usually try to put no more than 4 to 5 people in each breakout room. You can either assign automatically, which is nice if you have a big group, or manually. Usually what I do is I assign automatically, and you hit create breakout rooms, and what it'll do is bring up a list. It'll have the breakout room, the name, and who's in it. So again, there would be another breakout room here and a list of names of people in it. And you can rename the rooms, you can delete them. And then if there were more individuals here, when you clicked on their names, there would be options to move to a different room. So sometimes what I do is use that to shuffle people around as I see fit. So if I'm going to have a couple moderators in each room, this is where I could come to then reassign them to the rooms manually without having to manually assign everybody in the breakout rooms. So one of the nice things is after you've created these breakout rooms, it actually saves it for the entire Zoom meeting. So you can then return people to the same breakout rooms if you want. But you could also recreate breakout rooms if you want. You can add a room. So see, here's how I add a room. And then I can assign people to this room. Here's where I can move my participant to another room. So move to, and rooms come up. And then here under options, you can see that you can allow participants to move between breakout rooms automatically. So I don't do this in case-based teaching sessions, but this may be a good option for virtual interview days where you want people to move between different interest groups. You can allow participants to return to the main session at any time, or maybe you don't want to allow that. You can close breakout rooms automatically after a certain period of time. And then there's going to be a time where you close the breakout rooms as the host, and you decide how much time you want people to have before they are kicked back to the main room. I have this set at 60 seconds, which I think is the default. This is to allow people to have time to wrap up when the rooms are closed. But you could change this to whatever time you wanted. Okay, so before I open breakout rooms to people, there's one other thing that I do in my case-based sessions. And that is figure out a way that I can then monitor their progress. Because the one different thing about teaching virtually is you can't hear automatically what's going on in the room. So you have no idea how far along participants are in their discussion. So I think the best thing to do in this case is to have some type of editable document that you can watch. So what I like to do, I have found this new thing called Padlet that I really like. And it's kind of like a Google Doc, but here's what's cool about it. You can create little sticky notes. You can create a title, so maybe this is group 1, and maybe you want them to write a differential diagnosis. So each group can create their own sticky note. They can go in, create a differential diagnosis. You can add pictures and links and upload files. There's lots of options for what they can do. This is very similar to a Google Doc, but if you want groups to create small lists, I think this is more visually appealing. Padlet was free, and I just found it when I was searching for tools, but there's a lot of similar things out there. So here's what one of my sessions looked like when I asked a group to create a differential diagnosis for this young gentleman who was coming in with dysuria. And you can see here that each group had a different note, put their differential on there, and as they were doing it, I could see this in the main room. So everybody was in their breakout rooms, and I was watching, and I could see how far along they were in creating their differential diagnosis. So what I do with the breakout rooms is when you're ready for people to go to the rooms, you open rooms. Your participants will then have a message pop up to join their room. And now, as the host, you are sitting in the main room. Everyone joins their breakout rooms. Now, you'll notice here that you have an option to go join breakout rooms. And this is an option that's a little tricky. I've tried it a few times, and I will tell you that people are very shocked when you drop into their room. So you can click join, go join the breakout room. And I think it's important for you to tell people that you're going to do this. Because if you don't tell them that, then I think that they're often very shocked about it and it may make them feel a little uncomfortable. So I tell people whether or not I will join their rooms. And then when you want to leave a room, you just click leave room. And then you leave the breakout room, go back to the main session. Okay. So that is how you can use breakout rooms within your session. And so what you're going to do is decide when you want to close the rooms. And this, when you're ready to close, all you have to do is hit close rooms. You can broadcast a message to everybody. So you can say you have 2 minutes left to give them a little bit of warning if you want, or you could just close the breakout rooms and they have however much time you have provided them with. So I close rooms and then the participants see this countdown that says you will join the room in 54 seconds. They have the option to join earlier, but they will automatically get kicked back to the main room in that period of time. So that is how I use the breakout rooms. So one final thing that I want to show you, and this requires me to pull up my PowerPoint again. Let me see. All right, there we go. Share my PowerPoint. So one other thing you can do is have people annotate. So when I was doing this teaching session with this patient with dysuria, they had a urethral smear shown here. And I asked participants to circle where the bacteria was. So I've already showed you how you can use the whiteboard and do things like annotate, but you can see up here, every participant, if they go to the top of their screen and pull their menu down, has this option to annotate. It's the same things we use on the whiteboard, so they can draw, they can do circles, and you can see everybody's annotations appear all at once. Now, the important thing is those annotations stay. So you'll see here, if I move to a new slide, you see how the annotation stays. So the important thing is you have to clear annotations. You can clear all drawings, just your own drawings, or clear other people's drawings. So clear all drawings. So again, that's an important thing to do before you end up moving to the next slide. All right, so again, these were the tools that I talked about that you could use to lead an interactive teaching session. There are many more tools that you can use, but these are the ones that I found the most helpful, especially for case-based teaching sessions. For interaction, I think using things like the chat or using an editable document like Padlet, which I showed you, or potentially using a Google document or something like that. And remember that using breakout rooms is a great way to get people to talk in a small group. Just make sure that they know what they need to do when they come back. So in their small groups, they could work on a document that they will share when they come back, or you could instruct somebody to come back and report back to the group. So I hope that this was helpful for everybody. I am happy to be a resource to people if you have questions. I've had to experiment with this a lot, as most of my teaching sessions are pretty interactive small groups. So thank you for joining, and again, let me know in the future if there's anything that you need.